Good afternoon. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. As part of Miami University Alumni Association's webinar series, today we present Charles Anderson, the Miamian who spoke at Gettysburg. Joining us for today for what is going to definitely be a great story, we have alum and anthropologist Rob Tolley. Rob is a senior lecturer of anthropology and archaeology emeritus, retired from Indiana University East in Richmond, Indiana. He was formerly a visiting instructor of anthropology here at Miami for 15 years. Rob is a general anthropologist and has done archaeological exploration and survey throughout North America. Rob and his merger wife, Nancy, Dr. Nancy Purdue Tolley, also class of 76, now reside in the wilderness retirement home they built in Upper Green River in Wyoming, way out there in the middle of nowhere with lots of snow. He currently serves as president of the board of trustees of the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming. Welcome, Rob. We're so glad to have you. I am confident people are going to really enjoy this most fascinating tale with a lot of Miami connections. So welcome.
There's a lot of
my friend. Yes, there is. So thank you for sharing. And I'm gonna kick it right on over to you.
Okay, very good.
All right.
Welcome, everyone, from the Wyoming wilderness. And we're going to talk today a bit about an 1833 Miamian, Charles Anderson. Within this discussion, we're going to focus on his activities and his history, primarily in the Ohio Valley. But one of the important takeaways of this presentation, and one of the things I learned throughout the process of this exploration and discovery, is to look for connections. Our Miami educations, or the educations you received from wherever you got yours, will allow us to make connections when they appear, as long as we're paying attention. And paying attention is one of the important constructions of this talk. That as we look at various elements of history, where those connections occur can be very surprising and very revealing to our understanding of historical events, such as the events at Gettysburg. It's going to take us a moment to get to the Civil War, however, and I will remind you that I want you to remember, particularly those of you who are Miamians, remember all those classes that they made you take that you didn't think had anything to do with your major or your targeted career? Well, they're important. And as I'm going to illustrate today, particularly for me in some of my activities, they were critically important in helping me understand and interpret a very, very interesting discovery. When Nancy and I retired, we retreated to the Upper Green River Valley in Wyoming. We built our retirement home here. Winter comes here and stays, which was one of our objectives. This is the traditional landscape land that was part of the territory of the Wind River Shoshone, who have a reservation on the other side of the valley. Now, the Shoshone were, in most circumstances, smart enough not to spend the winters in this upper area of the valley. But we, on the other hand, savor some of the rigor involved in this. We wanted to have a rather rigorous retirement, and the environmental conditions here kind of keep us on our toes. The Upper Green River Valley, where our home is located, is legendary to some degree for its being the location of many of the key events in the Rocky Mountain fur trade, in particular the rendezvous era of the fur trade, which gets a lot of popular cultural exposure. A lot of that took place here. And, trust me, we're going to tie this together. We are part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And we enjoy a lot of our activities here, including we get some world-class birding here, particularly in the winter. Some of our neighbors, we in being up against the greater Yellowstone, being part of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we have lots of interesting neighbors. Our environment is very cold and very harsh. This is Sunday at about 2 in the afternoon. It was 10 below when I was out on cross country ski. We have and this rigorous life was something that we really were interested in doing. We have wolves who are regularly howling up behind the cabin, and a lot of wild animals around us. In particular, the moose are very, very critical of our wine selections here in the tough winters of the Wyoming wilderness. Lupin would much prefer Pomerol to this Medoc. Our neighbor Carolyn Surik, since sometimes we lose internet, has to come and do a concert with her viola da gamba. It can be a struggle here to survive the Wyoming winter. Some of our neighbors are glad that they did not participate in the fur trade, and we are able to participate in some of the and volunteer in the area. I am currently just off of my 3rd year as president of the Sublette County Historical Society. The Historical Society interprets the fur trade era, the rendezvous era of the fur trade, which began about 1824, which we're coming up on the bicentennial of that. And as a participant and a member of the administration of this museum, we're very, very active in both this and in the Sublette County bicentennial or centennial, which is presently in play. So you're going, well, thanks for the little local updates, Rob. What does this have to do with Gettysburg? How are we going to get from Sublette County to Gettysburg? Well, that's part of this story. I am primarily an archaeology anthropologist and in primarily a teaching position at IU East. That position allowed me to take students all over in exploring for archaeological sites. That was really the focus of part of my professional career. I was involved in a lot of archaeological survey, willing to go out and explore to locate things. I never had much in the way of resources at IU East to do any excavations, and therefore I led students on archaeological surveys on a regular basis. That was my particular focus. This is a quote from David Dixon's book, The Lost Gettysburg Address, which was one of the products of this work, in which he describes my general approach to doing archaeological survey. However, this statement, although it is intriguing and sounds very professional, is really not often a reflection of what happens. Because as an anthropologist and archaeologist, I really had to be prepared for anything that turned up. And the key construction of my career has been that you got to be ready to make this when discoveries throw things at you that you weren't expecting, and that the real character of a well-educated academic is what you do when you find something you weren't looking for. In 1980, I was a partner in some mountaineering in the Wind River mountain range of Wyoming here in Sublette County, where we live today. We spent about 3 weeks back in the Wind River Range climbing. Again, this is 1980, a little while ago. And when me and my partners completed our climbs, we were looking for a steak dinner. We came out to a little town called Pinedale, and a little place out in the sagebrush was recommended to us, a little spot called Fort William. Now, Fort William was a little hotel B&B steak restaurant that you really had to have reservations to get to. And it was here that I met Bartley and Rose Skinner. Now, Bartley would share with anyone who was interested the fact that he was the great-grandson of a former Civil War era Ohio governor. And being a mountaineer who had arrived there from Ohio looking for Bartley to cook a wonderful steak dinner for us, I found that interesting, but really had no particular, didn't really at that moment in time make a connection. But Bartley would carry on while he was drinking from your bottle of gin. He would carry on about the attributes of his great-grandfather, Charles Anderson. He had some of his great-grandfather's books and over the years, when we returned to Fort William on a regular basis and visited more and more with Bartley and Rose, he would bring out little things like his great-grandfather's Civil War presentation sword, and a cane that was given to his great-grandfather while he was lieutenant governor by the citizens of Columbus, Ohio. Well, I found this interesting. This was a worthwhile kind of a thing. And Bartley engaged me more and more over the years. And at one point in time, certain items started showing up at Bartley and Rose's place that were associated with Charles Anderson. And what was happening was a family home in Phoenix was being closed out by a distant nephew. And that nephew decided to send some of the objects, particularly things like this particular oil portrait of Charles Anderson, to Bartley. He sent some photographs, some books, and in about 2000, the nephew was about to throw out some rather sodden and moldy bags of things. He actually had put the bags of trash out by the dumpster, and the dumpster had been emptied without them being hauled away. And he reevaluated and looked at the papers and said, well, maybe I ought to send these to Uncle Bartley. And so he boxed this oddment collection of papers up and sent it to Bartley. Bartley's eyesight was failing at that point in time, and he enlisted my help, knowing I had a background in museums and museology, to identify just what was here, what was in the collection. And I found it interesting at the get-go. Remember, I was from Cincinnati, Ohio at the time, and from that area of the Midwest. And so Charles Anderson's materials had some interest. So I started going through And there was a hodgepodge of drafts of letters, papers, scraps of newspapers. But one of the first things I touched was this document. And I had not made the connection up to that point that Charles Anderson, Bartley Skinner's great-grandfather, was an 1833 graduate of Miami University. And one of the first documents that I set my hands on in examining the collection was Charles Anderson's graduation oration from his graduation at Miami University in 1833. Well, you could knock me over with a feather. I mean, here it was. There were papers, letters, documents. There were speeches written on legal pad. I didn't know legal pad dated, was that old. There were letters tucked into books. There were more pamphlets. Bartley and Rose, we looked at the collection of about 600 documents, and I realized that this was a gold mine, that it was one of those collections that really deserved some attention and some further examination. The first thing I had to do, though, was get a complete background on who Charles Anderson was. So I'm going to give you a quick primer. I want you to watch for connections because Charles Anderson was very, very well connected. He was part of the social and political elite of the time. This is a bit of a genealogical chart as such. Please note Charles Anderson is married to Eliza Brown here. Charles Anderson's father was Richard Clough Anderson. Richard Clough Anderson was first married to Elizabeth Clark. Please notice the connections here. Elizabeth Clark was the sister of George Rogers Clark, which, if you know your Ohio Valley history, is an important and significant person. William Clark, who made a trip out west along with a gentleman by the name of Lewis. We can connect Richard Clough Anderson's second wife, Sarah Marshall, to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. And please notice, as you see Charles Anderson, three of his brothers, Robert Anderson, that's the gentleman who commanded Fort Sumter, William Marshall Anderson, a widely known person, here's where the connections occur, who went west with the fur trade in 1834 and came to Sublette County area, to the area that is now Sublette County. Charles Anderson married Eliza Brown. Eliza was part of the Patterson Brown family of Dayton. Lars Anderson, who became a lawyer and in the Cincinnati area, was Charlie's oldest brother, who took over his father's role as patriarch when Richard Clough Anderson passed away. Now, Lars was continuously critical of Charles Anderson, because he never felt Charlie was going to be a success. He seemed too interested in birds, animals. He didn't seem to be serious about being a lawyer, and Lars was continuously pointing out to him that he would not be successful if he didn't straighten up and choose a career and follow the path of being a lawyer. Okay, a quick biographical sketch of Charlie Anderson. It's going to be quick. Strap yourself in, but he's well connected. He attended Miami University, enrolled in 1829, and graduated 1833. His childhood in Kentucky was privileged, with slaves in attendance. After graduation in 1833, he went out to Missouri with brother Robert. His brother William Marshall was in the area at the same time to start a farm. That failed. That particular the farm was a complete failure, and one person who was in that area of Missouri in 1834 told Charlie, "Look, give up. You're never going to be a successful farmer." That particular person happened to be a man by the name of Jefferson Davis. We'll be getting back to Jefferson Davis here in a little bit. When the farm failed, Charlie considered going west with the fur trade. His brother William Marshall Anderson wanted him to consider it because William Marshall was there, and we're trying to still make the connections, but we think that William Sublett may have actually enlisted Charlie to join him. He was, however, engaged to Eliza Brown, and so in 1835 returned to the Ohio Valley. He was a lawyer in Dayton. He ended up going into politics. Brother Lars going, "You're never going to be successful in politics. Charlie, give it up. You're going to be a financial failure." His brother Lars was constantly over his shoulder, criticizing his every move. In 1844, he went into the state Senate and worked to overturn some of the black laws, some of the laws restricting the rights of free blacks in Ohio. In 1845, he went on the Grand Tour. Now you're sitting there going, well, why is that relevant to his biography? Well, to be honest with you, when we read through all the biographical sketches of Charles Anderson that appear, including Walter Havighurst's discussion of him in Men of Old Miami, everybody mentions the fact that he did the Grand Tour. It was a prestigious thing, a trip that men and women of letters and social privilege always did. 1850s, he returned to Cincinnati and read law with the Rufus King firm. His brother Lars, right there in town, saying, "You're never going to make any good out of yourself doing this kind of thing." He did in the 1850s serve on the University Board of Trustees at Miami. In 1860, he decided he wanted to take a shot at farming again. His health was bad, asthma. Those of you who live in the Ohio Valley are familiar with that. And he ended up selling everything and moving to Texas. He bought a ranch there. And again, I'll remind you, he moved to Texas for his health, and then proceeded in 1860 to stand on street corners and go to rallies arguing for the preservation of the Union. This was not healthy in Texas in 1860. And the events of that little time he was in Texas could be a book unto themselves. He'd taken his entire family, his daughter Kitty and daughters Belle were with him, and their social activities in that area at the time included socializing with other of the social elite, including a gentleman by the name of Robert E. Lee. The family, when the politics of that area blew up, and secessionists like James Riley, also Miami grad, I will point out, criticized Charlie for being so adamant about the preservation of the Union. When the war broke out, he was jailed. The family escaped to Mexico first, and he later escaped to Mexico with the assistance of a Belgian astronomer. I don't make these details up. There are an immense amount of detail on this particular event in his life, including his daughter Kitty's diary of that particular period of time. So he arrives, Charles Anderson arrives back in New York in 1861, a hero. He's lauded nationally for being one of the people who stood up for the preservation of the Union in the face of the Texas secessionist wave. Charles Anderson or Lincoln sent him to England. He's presented at court. He is sent to England to argue for the preservation of the Union. And that went over just about as well in England as it had in Texas, if you're familiar with your Civil War history. In 1862, he came back and said, well, I'm going to get in the fight. Please remember that, like many of the social elite of that particular period, Charles Anderson's qualifications to lead a military infantry unit in combat were nil. His brother had defended Fort Sumter. His father had been a Revolutionary War hero, but Charlie led the 93rd Volunteer Infantry off into battle at the Battle of Stones River on January 1st with appropriate consequences. He was seriously wounded. His unit was shot up. On January 8th, I have a letter that he wrote to his daughter in which he is saying he's probably going to have to come home, that he had been seriously wounded. We're not quite sure where he was wounded. There's several different descriptions. I also have a description that suggests that Anderson suffered from what we would call camp disease, dysentery. So he comes back to Ohio, and his brother Lars is saying, don't go back into politics. You'll not be successful. And in November of 1863, after a long campaign, he's elected lieutenant governor of the state of Ohio. In 1865, he became governor after Governor Breaux died. Anderson could be characterized as one of Ohio's least distinguished governors. He didn't really do all that much, and he was kind of a placeholder while he waited for what he expected to be his assignment as ambassador to one of the European countries. He retired in 1866. In 1870, he and his son went down and they ended up starting a planned community in Catawba, Kentucky. This became very, very successful, by the way, and he died in 1895 in Catawba, and he failed to sign his will. Now you're going, well, Rob, why is it important that Charles Anderson failed to sign his will? Well, that gave me an important document, because every person around him whose handwriting I might encounter in evaluating the collection of papers had to sign off and accept the will, most of which was in his handwriting, as his true will. And so that gave me a Rosetta Stone around which I could work in evaluating what the documents, whose handwriting most of the documents were in. And clearly most of it was in Charlie's. So, gosh, it was quite a hodgepodge. There was a lot of Miami stuff. I'm not going to go into great detail on this. It was clear that he was engaged as a Miamian throughout his life. His graduation speech is a wonderful thing. It's an argument for the building of the Washington Monument, and it displays all the tutelage of Bishop and other of his major professors at Miami at the time. And it's dedicated to Eliza Jane Brown. Please recognize that Liza was probably the sister of one of his classmates. So we might actually be able to call Charlie a merger in a way from 1833. We had to look at what we were going to do with some of these collections. That was my initial target, was what do you do with the oil paintings? What do you do with the documents? I was trained at Miami University on how to handle this kind of circumstances when it arose. We've rather proudly arranged the donation of the Poindexter painting. This painting shows Charlie in the 1880s and probably pretty dragged down by asthma at that point in time. You can see it's a rather dark image. But here's Bob Wicks and my two children learning their lesson in stewardship of materials in donating the Poindexter painting to Miami University Art Museum. There were tons of things. I had to go through the entire collection, cataloging. I had his graduation speech. I had, there was a copybook that was every private letter he wrote while governor. That was, Ohio Historical was overwhelmed with that particular document. There was a letter from Charles Anderson to his daughter Belle, from Murfreesboro on January 9th when he had been wounded. And he spends the majority of the letter explaining to her why he can't raise her allowance. Wonderful stuff historically. There were lots of documents, scraps of papers and such. And believe me, as a field archaeologist, I was overwhelmed. But I soldiered through and identified each document in the collection and then subsequently did what I could to figure out where particular items and collections might go. But one particular speech befuddled me a little bit. It was on legal pad and it wasn't labeled. Of course, none of this stuff really was labeled very well. It was clearly a Civil War speech. I could tell it had been given at a battlefield. It was an original handwritten document by Charles Anderson. In this speech, Anderson made no direct reference to what he was specifically talking about. I could tell it was given at a battlefield. The war was ongoing according to the tenses. The battle was in the land of Penn and Franklin. But believe me, I hesitated as I was looking at this speech because I thought maybe it might be a speech from but I couldn't quite say the word because anthropologists from Indiana University don't find speeches from Gettysburg at ranches in the backcountry of Wyoming. But I did a little research, found some articles, and was able to identify that this particular speech, 42 pages long, on legal pad, handwritten in Charles Anderson's hand, was Charles Anderson's speech that he gave at the Gettysburg consecration ceremonies. And I was able to establish that the full text of the speech had never been published and was never identified in any other source than this document. I had Charles Anderson's Gettysburg Address. So the question was, what do we do with this? How do I so let's put this into a little bit of context. It wasn't mentioned in many of his biographies. None of his descendants knew about it. And believe me, if Bartley had known about this, he'd have bragged about it. Walter Havighurst, in his book, Men of Old Miami, does a complete profile, very nice profile of Charles Anderson, 1833 Miami grad. And although Walter Havighurst mentions Charles Anderson's grand tour, he makes no reference to Charles Anderson having spoken at Miami or having spoken at Gettysburg. So I realized I had the original speech from Charles Anderson's Gettysburg event. A quick synopsis. I'm not going to belabor these particular points at all. The battle was fought in July of 1863. A national cemetery was organized. Various folks were invited, including the governors of eight of the states that had units in the Ohio delegation came by train. Charlie wasn't on that train at that particular point in time, so he missed out on the whiskey party, which was much criticized in the Ohio press. They saw this particular tour as a junket. On November 19th, the dedication ceremony occurred. Charles Anderson was on the platform, along with William Dennison, former Ohio governor, and Miami alum. They would have heard Everett's 2-hour speech, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, but then everyone would, as the historical record proves, everyone packed up and went over to the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church to hear a speech given by Charles Anderson, who then was Lieutenant Governor elect. What did Lincoln and Everett say? You all know what Lincoln said, partially because depending on what age set you are in, you probably would have been required to memorize Gettysburg Address. You can thank your lucky stars. You were not asked to memorize Edward Everett's speech. He did in the style of the time, but it took 2 hours and he went into the battle in great detail, even statistics. Both of the speeches have over time been characterized as conciliatory. Anderson's speech, the evening event, was a firebrand event. He really let him have it. The speech goes into great detail about how arguing for the preservation of the Union and honoring the fallen dead. What did he say in the process of doing this? Well, he called the Confederates a lot of bad words. Okay, you can read this list these are all things he accused them of being. I had to look up pallid canutes. I didn't know what that meant. But he really let them have it. Please note that he accused the Confederates of this, of being nurtured by the milk of slaves in slavery, rocked in their cradles by servile hands. Please note that Charles Anderson, in his childhood, would have met this particular description. He was a a person who benefited in his economic and life from slavery. One of the things he did that was a little bit fun was he made sure to reference historical battles. He had that Miami education, and he was going to show it off. The document itself has some interesting things to show us. It could be suggested that he'd given a more effective speech than Everett. The original document gives us the opportunity, because it shows Anderson's editorial changes. As a document describing the speech, it's wonderful, but we also get to see some of the things that he changed, and some of the dimensions of his particular usage. For example, he liked the word oligarchy. He used it or its derivatives 17 times. In spite of being a highly educated Miami University grad, he still didn't get I before E except after C. The document has all of his editorial changes in several different editorial styles. For one, he would cross things out. In some circumstances, he actually erased the ink and came in and rewrote segments of it. He also made changes in pencil. We're not quite sure how that worked at that point in time, whether he was really changing in pencil very much or whether he added these at a later date. What did he have to say about slavery? It's not reflective of what you might think. He was very, very critical of the potential of Black immigration, and very, very much was critical of the possibility, relative to the union politics of the time, of having a situation where a slave state or a slave nation was south of was south and the North was a non-slave nation, and thereby Black immigration would occur at a high level. He was very, very concerned about that. To the degree that he stated that to avoid the problems of Black immigration, they would constitute a just and sufficient cause of war to the end of the century. This highlighted area is very disturbing, I want you to recognize, because Charlie's not a politician who is sitting there arguing without having experienced combat that the war should continue to go on for another 35 years. He's been wounded. He's seen men die in battle, and yet he still is taking the political line that we could fight the war to its conclusion. He crossed out a lot of things. He, in particular, suggestions that slaves should escape to happy homes. He crossed out descriptions of how bad slavery was. He made major changes in this speech, and we're still not sure as to some of the details of the why. His speech was please recognize that he was really trying to rally the troops. His goal was to raise everyone's ire, to make everyone willing to go out into that July evening or into that November evening and continue the war to its natural conclusion. He even suggests that they should burn the president. Please remember, this is Firebrand speech, and please remember, President Lincoln's in the room. He's in the front row. And Charlie has written, "Let them imprison, hang, burn our president with all the heads and hands of departments. Yet are we still a nation." A little bit of fun stuff. Here's Lincoln's entire Gettysburg Address. You're familiar with it. Charlie, in the construction of oration at the time, was the master of the run-on sentence. And in that, here we go. Here's Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And here is one sentence from Charles Anderson's Gettysburg speech. 272 words versus Charlie had a sentence that lasted 252 words. Charlie gave the speech of the evening, the speech that everybody wanted to hear. So he gave the closing speech at Gettysburg. He went on to become governor. And the question is, as we look at it now historically, as to why this wasn't given more attention. And why wasn't it ever published in full? Because that is one of the conundrums of this particular project. Why did Charles Anderson's Gettysburg Address get lost, which it has been now characterized as the lost Gettysburg Address? It has been suggested that Edward Everett's speech was too good and took up too much space in the newspapers. And this isn't just column inches, but the actual amount of type that the newspapermen had. They may have run out of letters. It's possible also that Anderson's speech really didn't work very well in print. A 252-word sentence? Are you kidding? Also could be suggested, although Charles Anderson had a national reputation at the time, that he wasn't prominent enough. Was the event really just an Ohio rally? Was it not as significant as the events earlier in the day? Or was the cemetery event itself something that historically at that moment was not seen as being all that important in the greater context of the war? It's also been suggested that Lincoln's Gettysburg Address became important when you made a bunch of school children memorize it, that it wasn't that big an event at that time. So what's next for Charlie? Our Miamian, our man of old Miami, who has been moderately successful up to this point and started in spite of brother Lars. It's quite clear he became bored with the lieutenant governor job. He was a short-term governor. In the 1860s, in late 1860s, he wanted an ambassadorship. He appealed for it. In the collection of papers, there were drafts of letters in which he's appealing for ambassadorships. He thinks he deserves to be ambassador to Germany, to be ambassador to England. It appears that please remember, here's a statement he said during his Gettysburg speech, that the president and secretaries are mere creatures of time and space, passing official breath, nothing infinitely less than nothing. He made these comments. Remember, he wanted to hang, burn President Lincoln, but no, he just didn't get any of those ambassadorships. So he and his son formed a planned community in Catawba, Kentucky. He became a bit of a snake oil salesman. They sold they made the pitch that the waters of the mineral springs had a healing effect. He was actively involved in family affairs. His daughter, Belle, married a Confederate officer. Remember all those bad words he said? Well, he's suddenly faced with having to accept a Confederate officer, a former Confederate officer, as a son-in-law, which he did. And Anderson lived out the rest of his life with a devoted family around him. I mentioned early on that there were some letters tucked in books, and here's where connections start to be made. I found this particular letter, which was written from Johnson's Island Civil War prison camp by Thomas Skinner, who became Charles Anderson's son-in-law. It has great details on life in the Civil War prison camp, various descriptions of moving to the camp on Johnson's Island in Lake Erie, including some accounting. Historians love this kind of detail. Here's what he spent on his money on for various things. He's describing this to his father. He's writing this letter to his father. I realized that this particular letter deserved a little special care, since it was from Johnson's Island, and I found the folks who managed the collections of the Johnson's Island Civil War camp, and one of the people who was associated with that was Dr. David Bush, professor of anthropology at Heidelberg College and a 1973 graduate of Miami University, Oxford, Ohio. He was glad to add that letter to the collections of the Johnson's Island Civil War Friends of Johnson's Island organization and to the collections associated with that Civil War camp. One quick little peregrination. You could say, well, why were some of these books so important, Rob? Well, here's a little history sketch, a biographical sketch of Charles Anderson, but it was one he owned in a book that was his. And so he has edited in pencil his own biography in this book, and very revealing details on his life, in which he's criticizing his own biographical sketch. This biographical sketch, by the way, does not include or describe his Gettysburg speech. So that's Charlie. Please recognize that his Gettysburg Address was lost, and it has now been found. He went on to be successful, brother Lars. And he always read with a pencil in his hand. And so he was always providing us more details up to the time of his death on his reflections on things he was reading. He and his wife Eliza are buried in Catawba Cemetery in their bed. It's a legendary grave site, and is reflective of they're buried side by side in the bed they shared for more than 60 years. I can call attention to the fact that one of the products of this particular project was Kurt Ellison was kind enough to include in the Miami Bicentennial book some comments about a comment about Charles Anderson's Gettysburg Address and him being the Miamian who spoke at Gettysburg. An entire book, David Dixon's Lost Gettysburg Address. David is a historian who contacted me and wanted a crack at this, which I was very, very glad to have him do. It's a wonderful biography, and it was one of my goals to have a full biography of Charles Anderson written as a result of this collection of papers. The David Dixon's book and some of the items from the collection also made significant contributions to Harry Stout's American Aristocrats, his description of the Anderson family in their particular period in the period of the 19th century. I mentioned at the very beginning that about the fur trade and the rendezvous era of the fur trade, and Charles Anderson's, and the fact that Charlie probably came pretty close to not being involved in Ohio history, but possibly involved in fur trade history. And please remember, I am involved in the Museum of the Mountain Man in Sublette County. William Marshall Anderson, Charles's brother, did go west with the fur trade in 1834 with William Sublette and came into the area of Sublette County. The county itself was formed by legislation in 1923 and is home of several of the Mountain Man rendezvous starting in 1824. So we have a centennial of Sublette County and a bicentennial of the fur trade coming up. And you're sitting there going, well, is this really, highly relevant? And I'm going, well, yes, because the father of Sublette County drew heavily upon the journals of William Marshall Anderson in helping preserve the history of the area and the history of the fur trade. This is a gentleman by the name of Perry Wilson Jenkins. He is characterized as the father of Sublette County. So in dealing with the centennial of Sublette County and celebrating it at the museum, we really are focusing on him. We drew some focus on him. He came out in 1905 and worked as a ranch hand. And he bought and developed a ranch and became a cattle baron, a very, very successful Wyoming cattleman. He went into the state Senate, where he introduced the legislation that formed Sublette County, the place that William Marshall Anderson visited and described so effectively in his journals. In 1923, he became president of the Sublette County Historical Society. Please remember, I am the current president of the Sublette County Historical Society. And drum roll, please, as we were examining his papers and documents held at the Sublette County Historical Society, yes, Perry Wilson Jenkins, the rancher, Western cattleman of Wyoming, is an 1890 graduate of Miami University, Oxford, Ohio. Honest people, I don't make this stuff up. I just report it. This is the story of we have his documents, and in his documents are all of his exams from when he was a student at Miami University, Oxford, Ohio. And he really loved Shakespeare. So you never know. This is where and how those connections can pop up, where and how those connections can be made. So Charles Anderson, class of 1833, a man of old Miami. This is one of his quotes, and we'll kind of leave it at this. He is the Miamian who spoke at Gettysburg and had his life threaded through the Civil War era with almost a Forrest Gump-like manner. So this is where he felt that he said this is how he feels about Miami, a statement he made in 1887. And obviously, it's his way of saying love and honor. I know that was a fast ride, but we've got other details. There are a lot more details that could be included, but this gives you a quick synopsis, and Molly's gonna help me a little bit in entertaining any questions that have come up.
Rob, that is just every time I hear it, and I've heard it a couple times now, it's just so fascinating. And particularly when you get to the part about Mr. Jenkins. And just, I
Well,
mean,
that only showed up really in the past 3 or 4 months.
well, that is the cherry on top of all of these
Right.
sort of commingling tales of Miamians and their great adventures west, that's for sure. That is such a fun story. So I do have a couple questions and a couple
Okay.
comments. Hopefully you can shed a little light. So Luetta, she actually asks, are there other books? And I know you mentioned, for example, American Aristocrats and the Lost Gettysburg Address. But she wants to know, are there other books where they can read the dates and details that you gave sort of throughout your presentation? And she also wonders if you used to run a Civil War history event in Richmond back in the early 90s.
Let's see. The books I've mentioned are pretty comprehensive. In particular, Harry Stout's book takes the entire Anderson clan and describes them in great detail. I couldn't spend any time, for example, on Richard Clough Anderson's activities during the Revolutionary War. There's an immense amount of volume as such. I'd recommend Harry Stout's book, and for fine-tuned details on Charles Anderson, David Dixon's book. There is another book that is rooted. Let's see. This is a book recently written about their time in Texas that was that describes that experience through Kitty Anderson's diaries. Let's see. No, I really, to be honest with you, and this is one of the classic conundrums of the liberal arts education. I honestly am not a Civil War scholar in any way, shape, or form. And no, I didn't do any reenactments. Primarily, I was an archaeologist, anthropologist there at IU East. And so I wasn't involved in any of that. So.
Although I do like that period costuming, though. That's pretty.
Yes.
Okay, next question is from Clark. He mentions, through your research, did you happen to stumble upon any articles or read anything about Whitelaw Reid? He was class of 56 here at Miami. I guess he wrote quite a bit about the Civil War as a special correspondent and wrote under the byline Agates.
Yes. And Whitelaw Reid's is described, again, please remember how much of a hodgepodge this particular collection of Charles Anderson's papers were. But Charlie references, for example, attending an event in New York City in which Whitelaw Reid organized, believe in the 1870s. So yes, Whitelaw Reid is present in much of the papers and descriptions that I saw, but nothing in direct line, not quite as well established as, for example, former Governor Dennison being in participation. The other thing I would love to see done, and haven't been able to do a good enough job with, is to find all the people of Miami connection who did attend the event at Gettysburg. We've got General Schenck there. We've got Dennison. We've got Anderson. There are probably a lot more.
Mm-hmm. I might agree with that. I mean, just proximity, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Stuart says, it's great seeing you again, Rob. I don't know many people who live in your immediate area, but they sure do have your same passion for history and connections. Let's see. Sorry, my screen refreshed and I lost my place. Have you ever convinced any of them to visit Miami University and or enroll? All the dots you connected in this discovery are amazing. So what kind of nice things do you have to say to your Wyoming friends about Miami?
Oh, well, it's hard not to be in praise of it. I was talking. We were at an event. My daughter lives here in the area and is part of a regional land trust. And so we were visiting with a wildlife biologist who works here with Wyoming Game and Fish. And we were at an event and having some dinner and comparing notes and meeting this nice man and his wife, and she was with the regional BOCES and was doing some teaching online, and he's a wildlife biologist, and we get visiting a little bit, and they say, "Oh yeah, well, we know Miami. We're a merger." So we bump into Miami people out here all the time.
And mergers too.
And mergers too.
Double the fun. That's for
right.
Sure. Well, Rob, this has been wonderful. We're a little over our time, and I just want to remind our viewers, if you need to come back and watch a little bit later, you're welcome to do so. There will be a recording of this webinar available on our website later today, so you can go back and check out all those dates and sort of the finer details of this crazy cool story. So you can see that and our other webinar presentations at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Thank you all for joining us today. Love and honor to you all. Rob, thank you again, my friend, for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
Have a great day.